something that is incredible. He's the founder, CEO, and president.
Donald Trump's America is running out of people to scare. For years, he has bullied allies, baited rivals, and treated the global financial system like one of his failed casinos, something to be squeezed, not stewarded. Now the bill is coming due. Europe is openly gaming out how to protect itself from Washington. Investors are quietly edging away from U.S. debt, and the foundations of American power, its alliances, its currency, its reputation for basic stability, are being chipped away from within. This is not just bad manners or ugly rhetoric. It is a deliberate, reckless assault on the very machinery that has kept the U.S. rich, influential, and secure for generations. And if it continues, the story of the next decade will not be America first, but America smaller. Donald Trump's escalating confrontations with Europe over debt, NATO, and Greenland are turning the United States from anchor of the global system into its biggest source of instability. And the U.S. economy is already paying the price in lost trust, rising risk, and a shrinking circle of willing partners. Turning treasuries into a weapon. For decades, U.S. Treasury bonds have been the world's ultimate safe asset, backed not just by America's tax base, but by a reputation for stability, predictability, and basic sanity in economic policy. Trump is methodically shredding that reputation by openly threatening big retaliation if European governments or funds dare to sell U.S. debt or reduce their exposure to American markets. In a Fox Business interview, Trump warned that if Europe dumped treasuries or other U.S. assets, there would be big retaliation, and boasted that the U.S. holds all the cards. That is not the language of a responsible issuer. It is the language of a hostage taker, telling creditors that buying U.S. debt comes with political strings attached. At the same time, real money is walking. A Danish pension fund, Academiker Pension, has already confirmed it is dumping its entire U.S. Treasury portfolio of around $100 million, explicitly citing concerns about the U.S. fiscal and political trajectory. Individually, $100 million is a rounding error in a multi-trillion-dollar market. Collectively, it is a warning flare. When investors start to believe that a U.S. president might punish them for reallocating their portfolios or link debt holdings to unrelated territorial demands about Greenland, they begin looking for safer, less politicized options. Every basis point of extra yield the Treasury has to offer to overcome those fears is a quiet tax on the U.S. economy, forcing Washington to spend more servicing debt and less on productive investment at home. Shrinking foreign capital. Foreign investors don't move trillions overnight, but they do react to risk over time. Trump's message to Europe is stark: hold our bonds and equities on my terms, or we will hit you with tariffs, sanctions, or other forms of retaliation. That turns what should be a mutually beneficial financial relationship into a rigged game where Europe is treated not as a partner but as a delinquent vassal. This is already changing behavior. European funds that can quietly diversify away from treasuries, dollar assets, or U.S. tech stocks now have a concrete political reason to do so. Governments in the EU are openly debating economic responses and strategies to reduce their vulnerability to Trump's threats, including shifting reserve composition and building parallel structures in payments and defense so they are less exposed to U.S. pressure. Those discussions used to be fringe. Trump has dragged them into the mainstream. The U.S. benefited for decades from what economists called exorbitant privilege, the ability to borrow cheaply because the world trusted Washington more than any alternative. When a president uses that privilege as a cudgel and hints that allied central banks and pension funds could be targets, that privilege erodes. The result is a slow-motion squeeze, weaker demand for treasuries, higher borrowing costs, and less room for fiscal policy at home, against a backdrop of already bloated deficits. Wrecking the alliance that underwrites prosperity. Trump's damage isn't confined to bond markets. He's also hacking away at the U.S. alliance network that underpins both national security and economic strength. In a stunning display of contempt, he claimed that the United States had never needed NATO allies in Afghanistan and suggested that Allied troops stayed a little off the front lines, comments that triggered outrage among European veterans, families of the fallen, and politicians. British Armed Forces Minister Alistair Cairns, who served 5 tours in Afghanistan, reminded Trump that the only time NATO ever invoked Article 5 was after 9/11, when Europeans rushed to defend the United States and shed blood alongside American troops. Former UK military leaders called Trump's remarks disrespectful, wrong, and outrageous, and Polish officers said he had crossed a red line, given how many of their soldiers died in a war America asked them to fight. This is not just a war of words, it is a direct assault on the moral foundation of the alliance. Economically, that matters. NATO's credibility reassures investors that Europe and North America are part of a coherent security community, reducing the risk of conflict and supporting cross-border trade, investment, and currency stability. By insulting allies and trivializing their sacrifices, Trump turns NATO from a stabilizing asset into a political punching bag. European officials are now openly saying that if there is any benefit to his ramblings, it is that they prove Europe must do more on its own, build independent capabilities, hedge against U.S. unreliability, and be ready for direct confrontation if necessary.
Greenland obsession and strategic paranoia. Nowhere is Trump's corrosive impact clearer than in the surreal saga of Greenland. What began as a bizarre "Buy Greenland" idea has morphed into a persistent campaign in which he links U.S. protection of the island to NATO obligations and economic leverage over Denmark and the EU. Politico and other outlets report that European governments are now gaming out last resort options to save Greenland from Trump, including financial packages, stepped-up EU funding, and even increased defense deployments in the Arctic to preempt unilateral American moves. Trump has repeatedly said the U.S. deserves Greenland because it would be forced to defend it against Russia or China. And he has openly tied his threats of tariffs against Germany, France, Britain, and Denmark to their resistance to his Greenland ambitions. That is textbook geopolitical blackmail. Accept U.S. territorial designs or face economic punishment. In response, Brussels is planning to more than double its spending on Greenland from 2028 onward, aiming to give Greenlanders an alternative to Trump's promises of American money and military muscle. All of this feeds a narrative in Europe that the United States under Trump is not a predictable guarantor of order, but a hyperpower to be contained. If European governments decide they must be prepared for direct confrontation with Trump to defend their own territory and interests, they will naturally look for ways to reduce reliance on U.S. finance, technology, and defense goods. That means fewer European purchases of U.S. weapons, less use of U.S. platforms, and more efforts to build EU-centric systems. In short, less demand for American exports and know-how. How this shrinks U.S. economic power. The most dangerous myth in Trump's rhetoric is that the U.S. has all the cards.
In reality, the U.S. economy is powerful precisely because it is interwoven into a global system of trust. Allies host U.S. bases, buy U.S. arms, hold U.S. debt, adopt U.S. technology, and follow U.S. standards. Trump is systematically sawing through every plank of that platform. Shrinking foreign demand for treasuries and U.S. equities means higher interest rates than otherwise needed to attract buyers, raising borrowing costs for households, firms, and the government. Less fiscal space for infrastructure, education, and innovation as interest payments eat up a bigger share of the federal budget. Greater vulnerability to financial shocks when foreign central banks or funds decide to accelerate diversification away from U.S. assets. Fraying alliances and open contempt for NATO partners mean more pressure on the U.S. defense budget as allies begin to doubt U.S. commitments and spend more independently, duplicating capabilities instead of sharing burdens. Reduced markets for U.S. defense exports as European governments consider shifting procurement away from American suppliers to avoid political dependence. Heightened geopolitical risk premia as investors price in the possibility of severe transatlantic rifts, tariff wars, or base closures. The net effect is a U.S. economy that feels bigger on paper, high nominal GDP, giant markets, but functionally smaller in influence, less able to set the rules, less able to borrow cheaply, less able to count on allies in crises. That is what shrinking looks like for a hegemon, not an overnight collapse, but a steady erosion of trust, leverage, and room for error.
A president at war with his own advantages. Trump markets himself as a master negotiator, yet he is torching the very advantages every previous U.S. president, Republican and Democrat, worked to preserve. By threatening foreign creditors, insulting allied soldiers, and treating a strategic territory like a casino chip, he is advertising to the world that the United States under his watch is volatile, vindictive, and willing to politicize everything. European officials are not naive. They see that as a structural risk, not a temporary personality quirk. Hence the whispered talk in Europe of dumping Trump, of exploring ultimatums and last resort measures to constrain U.S. behavior, even at the cost of a severe breakdown in transatlantic relations. If that red line is ever crossed, the damage to the U.S. economy would be profound. Loss of access to bases, reduced arms sales, fragmented regulatory standards, accelerated de-dollarization, and a long-term hit to the country's reputation as a safe place to park capital. Trump insists that America's contributions to NATO dwarf that of other countries, and that he is simply making Europe pay more. In reality, he is demanding tribute while trashing the very alliance that amplifies U.S. power. And he's doing it in ways that push Europe to plan for a future in which the U.S. is no longer the indispensable partner, but the problem to be managed. When historians sit down years from now to write the story of this era, they will not marvel at some grand strategic genius who bent Europe to his will and made America stronger. They will see a president who took a position of unparalleled strength, trusted debt, loyal allies, a dominant currency, and smashed it against the rocks of his own ego. They will trace the higher borrowing costs, the fractured alliances, the shrinking circle of partners willing to buy American debt or follow America's lead, and they will point to this moment as the turning point, when the world quietly stopped believing the United States could be trusted to hold the center. The greatest tragedy is that none of this was inevitable. It is a choice made in tantrums and threats to trade away long-term prosperity for short-term applause. The only question left is whether Americans will decide in time that the price of Trump's greatness is a future in which their country is poorer, weaker, and increasingly alone.